The Mullah Asghar Memorial Library and Islamic Resource Center opened its doors on October 24, 2009. Dignitaries throughout were invited to share their views on the importance of this center, while Dr. Walji informed the visitors of the vision of this remarkable resource center. April 2011 saw the inauguration of its first exhibition on the Holy Quran, entitled From Parchment to the iPad, displaying the Word of God through the expression of man. Saturday, September 15th, 2012, marked the opening of the Hajj exhibition. Over 8 months in preparation, the exhibition was designed to convey the deeply personal experience of Hajj, a journey of a lifetime for Muslims. The From the Roots of Abraham exhibition was inaugurated on September 13th, 2014, with visitors from multiple faiths exploring the common values of Abrahamic faiths. Shortly after, under the direction of Dr. Hasnain Walji, Mark produces a full 2-hour documentary, The Khojas, A Journey of Faith. This has received international acclaim as an anthropological film.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to the Mullah Asghar Memorial Library and Islamic Resource Center for Conversations with Authors, a series of interviews and chats with authors and academics from our community and others. Today, we're privileged to welcome Professor Liakat Takim of McMaster University, Ontario, Canada. And this is the second in the series called Conversations with Authors, which we hope to continue through the coming weeks, and we hope you'll be able to join us. A little bit about him first. Professor Takim is the Sharjah Chair in Global Islam at McMaster University in Canada. A prolific writer and speaker, he has authored more than 130 scholarly works, which have been published in various journals, books, and encyclopedia. He has written on a wide range of topics, such as Reformation in Islam, the role of custom in shaping Islamic law, Islam in the Western diaspora, Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic mystical tradition, Islamophobia, the treatment of women in Islam, law, and many other topics. Professor Takim has spoken at more than 110 academic national and international conferences. He has addressed audiences in different parts of the world, ranging from Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, to East Africa, Dubai, and North America. He has published 3 books and is now working on his 4th book, called Ijtihad and Reformation in Islam. Professor Takim has taught at several universities and is actively engaged in dialogue with different faith communities. So without further ado, Dr. Takim, welcome to Mark, and thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I'll move straight to the first question. What or who motivated you to pursue Islamic studies as a future career path and a way of life?
I was always interested in religion from my childhood. In 1981, there was an opportunity. Simco actually sponsored, invited students to study Islam at the University of Virginia. I think I was the only one who actually did apply, and I got through. It was supposed to be at the master's level, so I wanted to learn more about myself, about my religion. I wasn't sure where it would lead me to, whether I would get to where I am now, but Allah charts His own ways and His own paths for us.
And when did you start writing books, and what has your writing journey been like since then?
Well, when you are in the academic field, we have a particular saying that publish or perish. In other words, if you do not publish, then you will perish as an academic. So, as a student, you're mainly writing term papers and papers for the supervisor or for the faculty. Yeah. But soon after I finished my doctorate in London in 1990, I kind of started publishing a few papers. My first couple of 2 or 3 papers were actually articles published in either books or journals, and that kind of started. And also translated quite a number of books before publishing my own book. So I translated some works too.
Okay, and so you've written other books and several articles and papers, but I'd like today to focus on your book, Shi'ism in America, which was published 11 years ago in 2009. Can you tell us what prompted you to write about this topic in particular, how long it took to write the book, and if you can, what were some of the challenges that you met along the way?
Yeah, for a long time in the 1990s, scholars were discussing Islam in America. First, they were discussing Islam in America. Then they started talking about Islam in America or Islam in the West. But what I noticed was that most of it was written from Sunni lens. In other words, it was as if the Shias do not exist, or if they were on the periphery, and the Shias were the voiceless, if you like. And I felt that this was improper, that, we should be talking about Shi'ism in America, because historically, the Shia community migrated with the Sunni community in the 1880s from what was that time called Greater Syria. Now we call it Lebanon. So the Shias have been in America, especially, and even in Canada, for a very long time. But their story was not told. And I felt that if we do not speak about ourselves, others will. So there was very little written about Shi'ism in America. There was one book written by Linda Walbridge, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago from cancer. But she was focused more on the Shia community in Dearborn, Michigan. So it was more what we call ethnographic, in other words, focused on a particular community. So that was a main reason why I wrote. It took me approximately 10 years to write. It was a very long time to write a book, abnormally long. You asked about the challenges I faced. The problem was that there was nothing that was really written substantial about that. So a lot of my work involved field work. In other words, visiting centers, sending out surveys, talking to people, trying to trace, because especially when you're talking of history, for example, of Shi'ism in America, when there's nothing written down, you are forced to kind of talk to people, many of whom are in the 80s or 90s and who were born in America. The earliest person that I met was actually a Shia lady who was born in America, was in 1908 in New York. So that kind of tells you how long the history of Shi'ism in America is. But as I say, it was quite a challenge simply because of the surveys, of the data that I was collecting, of having to travel. And sometimes the Shia community themselves felt a bit reluctant to share the information. And that wasn't, that made it even more difficult.
Interesting. I would expect then that the need to do fieldwork and to visit various centers around the continent and to talk to people also contributed towards the length of time it took to write the book. Would you
Absolutely.
agree?
It did take a long time simply because of that, having to interview people, sometimes having to go to the Arab Museum in Detroit, for example. It's a very interesting museum there, and trying to figure out the Muslim contribution to America, and also more particularly the Shia contribution to America. Then, because the Shias were not only concentrated in one part of America. That's a mistake for us. There were Shias living, for example, in places like New England, in New York, some in Sacramento. We know of some in North Dakota, South Dakota, in Iowa, etc. So I was trying to kind of piece together all these different aspects to form one whole history of the Shias in America.
I once heard somebody say that in the West, Shias are essentially a minority within a minority, meaning that Muslims as a whole are a minority over here, and that Shias are another minority within them. Do you think that explains the relative dearth of scholarship about Shi'ism here, and is there potential for more?
Definitely, the Shias are the minority within the minority. And of course, the other challenge is that the Shias themselves are divided. So sometimes you are a minority within a minority within a minority. And God help you if you happen to be a female Shia within the Muslim American community. You are in triple of minority status. And also don't forget that for many, the Sunnis are, for the outsiders, non-Muslim, the Sunnis are the voice of America, of Muslims in America. And in fact, until the 1950s and 60s, it wasn't even the Sunnis who were talking about Islam. It was groups like the Ahmadiyya who had come here in the 1920s to convert. And there was the Nation of Islam that was speaking on behalf of Islam in the form of Elijah Muhammad and then Malcolm X until he fell out, and so on. There were other groups. But the Muslims themselves were not very vocal until the 1960s or so. But then that changed later. But the Shias especially, I think, until the 1990s, they were kind of very much on the peripheral, on the margins. And frankly, I felt that there was a need for change. And even today, if you look at the State Department, for example, when the media invites Muslims, you'll hardly ever get a Shia figure speaking there. There are a few for sure, but not too many.
So you would agree then that there is potential for more scholarly work in this area, and something maybe to encourage our youngsters and our future writers to pursue and follow up on?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the field is vast and it's developing, and there are different aspects of Shi'ism in America. I wrote a kind of an overall book, and that, by the way, is outdated now. You need to kind of update it because things change. When I was writing, there were approximately 2 million Shias in America. Now, so some of them do not even identify themselves as Shia. But there are, for example, there are areas in Los Angeles, there are so many Iranians, they call it Tehran Angeles instead of Los Angeles. That kind of gives you an idea. There are approximately 70 to 75,000 Shias in Dearborn alone.
Yeah.
That gives you the kind of scope for the development of different aspects of the Shia community in North America.
I read the book with great interest and learned an awful lot from it that I didn't know before. In the introduction section, you recognize the fact that the composition, and I quote here, the composition of the American Muslim community is far from homogeneous. American Islam is a mosaic of many ethnic, racial, sectarian, and national groups, end of quote. Mm-hmm. So from a historical perspective, can you briefly tell us or talk about where all these groups came from and what this mosaic is made up of?
Yeah, you're talking about the whole Muslim community or the Shia community?
From the Shia community.
From the Shia perspective, as I mentioned earlier, the earliest Shias that I've been able to trace came from Greater Syria, what now called Lebanon, in the 1890s, 1880s. What was happening was, America was kind of opening up to the world, and there was a lot of job opportunities here, whether it was in the railroads, whether it was in the factories, in the shipping industry in Quincy, Massachusetts. So you got Christians from Lebanon coming, and then Sunnis and Shias coming together sometimes. And then later on, and by the way, something that we should also know, that even on the Titanic, we know for sure there were at least 3 Shias, maybe more, at least 3. One of them survived, a person by the name of Fatima Masalmani. She survived because, being a woman, she was allowed to get on the boat. And interestingly, contrary to what many people think, the Shia center at that time was not Dearborn or Detroit, it was actually Michigan City. And Michigan City is not in Michigan, it's actually in Indianapolis.
Indiana. Yeah, Indiana.
Indianapolis, state of Indianapolis. Indiana. So she was heading there, and she also the Titanic. But what we find later on, especially after the Second World War, is Shia communities from different areas, different parts of the world coming, whether it was, for example, from India and Pakistan, from Iraq, from Iran, primarily to study here, primarily. And then the American immigration system kind of opened up in the 1960s, plus the persecution that Shias faced in different parts of the world, whether it was Afghanistan, because of the Russian invasion, the Bangladesh and Pakistan, and the problems in East Africa, of course, with Idi Amin. And you had problems in different parts of the world. Later on, we had Saddam coming in Iraq. All those precipitated and encouraged Shias to migrate in one way or another to America. So the composition of the Shia community changed drastically in the 1980s, 1990s. And also, let's not forget the African American community, which became more aware of Shi'ism. Interestingly, how they became aware was because the Wahhabis started speaking out against the Shias so much that people started asking, well, who are these Shias, who are being criticized so much? So in many ways, the Wahhabis kind of did us a favor by criticizing us so much, and people became more aware of the presence of the Shia community.
Thank you for that. In the first chapter called Origins and Early History of Shias in America, you devote a few paragraphs to each of these ethnic or national communities or groups that came here, including our own Khoja community. What kind of pressures did those early American Shia face in order to conform to American mores and to assimilate into American culture?
Yeah, that's actually a very loaded question, but very, very briefly, that varied depending on when the community came. So, for example, the early Shias, up to about the 1940s, 1950s, when I talked to them, they would either meet in houses, etc. And incidentally, the first mosque, the second mosque in America, was established by the Shias. Many people do not know that. The first was done by the Sunni community in Detroit, but the second mosque in 1924 in Michigan City, Al-Asr al-Jadid as it was called. But we faced, up to the 1940s, the community tried to assimilate itself to America. And I would caution everybody from using the word assimilate, because we often use it without realizing what it means. Assimilation means to be at one with. In other words, you are willing to give up your cultural, religious identity in order to blend into the mainstream community. And the Shias often did that. For example, there was no hijab, there was no sense of halal meat, etc. But as the community became more solidified in the 1940s, in Detroit, they bought what was a bank at one time and turned it into a hall, meeting hall called Hashemite Hall. But they were mainly assimilated into the mainstream American community, not all of them, of course. I also found that the Muharram rituals were not really observed to great length until the 1960s, when the first Shia mosque was actually built in Detroit in Joy Road, Islamic Center of America. But later on, I think that in the 80s, as the Pakistani communities came, the Iranians, the Iraqis, part of the challenge was to build their own centers, to create a Shia identity, not to be assimilated into the American culture. And above all, also there was the added challenge now of to be able to respond to the Wahhabi and Salafi attacks against the Shias.
Most appropriately, we are discussing things today, a few days after the commemoration of Ashura and the Battle of Karbala. And so it's probably topical and appropriate for me to ask you this question, and that is, in that first chapter, referring to the South Asian Shia community, you described their close affinity to their culture and ethnicity, giving as an example the ritualized services in Muharram, the lectures and symbolic representations of the Battle of Karbala. While that is very much a South Asian characteristic, you also went to describe how Muslims tend to coalesce around mosques that are frequented by people from the same background. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I'm hearing that they're having a lot of echo sound. Is that correct?
I'm Hussein. Hussein Karim.
Let me know, so I can try and switch to another mode.
Yeah.
In any case, the question was why the people coalesce around certain types of mosques.
Yeah, based on the same background. So why do you think that Muslims tend to coalesce, and not just Shias, but Muslims in general, tend to coalesce around mosques that are frequented by people from the same background?
Because when people come to America, and that happens to not only to Muslims but other groups too, they feel homesick basically, and one way of alleviating that homesickness is to meet around people of your own group, of your own culture, in a religious setting. So some people call it the homesick mosques, you know, that you go there, Pakistanis would like to be with fellow Pakistanis, Iranians, and so on. And also they want to hear the lectures in the way that they heard it in their homes, and also they want to participate in rituals the way that they've always done it. The problem arises that when you have a small community, where you have people from different ethnic, cultural backgrounds coming together, and then you have to start sacrificing some of those home programs, you know, the homesick mosques kind of give way to multi-ethnic centers. That's part of the challenge that Muslims have to engage in. And also, let's not forget the younger generation who do not identify themselves with, for example, the ethnic mosques or the culture of their parents. So, and they cannot even understand in many cases the languages that their parents speak or the Maulana speaks. So you get a lot of tensions, not only, for example, between Shias and other Shia, but even within the same ethnic Shia community, between the younger generation, the older generation, sometimes between different ethnic groups within the Shia community. And as I mentioned, let's not also forget the African American Shias who cannot blend in to any of these ethnic mosques.
Yeah. Interesting. So if we talk about the subject of unity then briefly, despite our common beliefs as Shias, like belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Tawheed, prayers, fasting, reverence for our imamat and the leadership of Ali ibn Abu Talib, you contend that our unity melts away in the face of ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and national differences. Do you not?
Yes, and that's very true, because what unites us are those basic beliefs.
Yes.
Sometimes when it comes to practices, our practices are often what we may call culturally conditioned. So our marriage practices, even the Muharram rituals, the kind of food that we eat, the kind of people that we like to hang out with. So because of that, that kind of unity of the Shia community becomes dissipated, if you like, because of the ethnic, cultural differences, where people feel more comfortable going to. And therefore, you know, but I'm happy to say that the younger generation, the youth, they are more interested in what I call de-ethnicizing the community. In other words, to remove all these ethnic, cultural barriers to form one overall, overarching Shia community.
Right. And would you say that that uneasy unity, if I can describe it as that, is more accentuated in Shi'ism than in Sunnism?
Yes, definitely. The reason being because the Sunnis do not have some of the rituals that the Shias do. So that is the Sunni community's main rituals are what? The prayers, the Friday prayers, for example, and some programs which anybody can partake in. Whereas we have what, as I called it, the kind of culturally conditioned rituals, whether it is the Muharram rituals, we have the wafats, we have the wiladat, that is khoshalis, and so on, which are often marked based on our own culturally ways of doing things. So because of that, I think there is more, the cultural factor is more accentuated and more important in Shia Islam than it is in Sunni Islam.
In the second chapter of the book, you write at some length about how certain religious occasions are marked in different ways depending on the community's national or ethnic background. I quote, "Cultural differences within the Shia community are most visible in the genres and running of programs held at centers." So given the fact that we just commemorated Ashura Day, it's probably appropriate to mention an example you point to, which is Azadari and how it is practiced. Please tell us some more about that.
Yeah, the practice of Azadari has been there, of course, for a very long time. And when the community came here, whichever community, Iranian, Iraqi, Pakistani, Pakhojas, they wanted to perpetuate, if you like, continue their forms of rituals which they always enacted back home. They wanted to do it here. And as I said, some of that led to the ethnicization, sometimes even split within communities. Some of it sometimes even within the same Pakistani community, for example, there were splits. Because some people wanted to do the rituals one way, the others wanted to do the other way. Some people wanted to do the Zanjir Matam, for example. Others said no. So we have, for example, those communities who do the Zanjir Matam even here in America, although they do it within the confines of the courtyard of the mosque, not inside the mosque. There are those who just do very light matams. And of course, there are those who do the Latmiya. There are those who do the Saf. And all these are kind of different ways of marking the same event.
Yes.
So that often tends to create sometimes tension between the communities, sometimes, because people do not understand the language of whether it is the majlis itself or whether it is the rituals. Some people just prefer and just love to do the ritual the way that they did it back home because they love that source, as the Pakistanis would call it, or the Indians would call it, or the poetry that they used to hear of Mir Anis, and they miss it in these multi-cultural, multi-ethnic communities.
Tell us more about that anecdote that you mentioned in the book about the Denver Mosque. I think that will help to highlight the point we're trying to get at here, if you don't mind.
No. I mean, I wrote about it and I experienced it personally. I lived in Denver for a number of years. And on the day of Ashura, I remember, now as we are aware, the Pakistanis and Indians and even the Khoja community observe the Faqas. And this is not in any way condescending or looking down upon any community, just merely trying to state the obvious, which is that there are differences within the community. So the Pakistanis and the Indians and the Khojas were observing the Faqa on the day of Ashura, which means, for those who are not aware, Faqa means that you abstain from food until Asr time, commemorating the events in Karbala to kind of generate or to remember the thirst and the hunger that Imam Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt experienced. Whereas the Lebanese and the Iraqi and the Iranians do not have such a system. So what happened was we went to the mosque hoping to do the Amal, and the Iraqis, most of them were Iraqis, some Lebanese, were reading the Maktal, that is the events of Karbala from cover to cover from a book. And we were trying to do the Amal. They said, well, we have to finish this first, then you can do. So we literally had about 15 minutes just to do the whole Amal. And after the Salat, they laid out the food for the people to eat. And of course, the Pakistanis and the Khojas were not eating at that point in time. So you had, some people feasting, others fasting in the same hall at the same time.
Interesting. And since you referred to Faqa, the half fast, I actually had a question sent to me in advance from one of our subscribers and viewers in England who asked, what is the basis or validity of the concept of Faqa? Is there any?
Well, briefly stated, there are some reports, and even Ibn Taymiyyah says that the Banu Umayyah used to fast, celebrating the martyrdom of Imam Hussein. And we do not do that, although it is not haram to fast on the day of Ashura, but we do not do that because we do not feel that we should be celebrating. And there are also some reports, which I don't really want to get into, that the Prophet used to fast on the day of Ashura because this was a Jewish holiday. This is within the Sunni books, by the way. Most of our reports would say no, there's no such fast on the day of Ashura. But in order not to mimic what the Banu Umayyads did, some groups within the community actually observe the half fast, the Faqa. But this is not a universal Shia phenomenon. In other words, it's not something that all the Shia communities do. Primarily, those from India, Pakistan, and the Khoja community will observe the Faqa.
Last question before I turn over to the audience. And this is more a general question than specifically to do with your book, although your book may point to some of the answers. And the question is, how do you think Islam has and can shape Shia civic and political consciousness in America?
I don't know whether Islam can do it or whether the Islam themselves and the Shia community can do it, because there is definitely a feeling within the community that we, that is the Shia community, have to play our part in shaping or responsible serving the non-Muslim community, the American or Canadian community, our civic social responsibilities. So what we find, especially in the youth community, and especially since 9/11, I found that the Shias have tried to raise their own voices, to become more vocal and more visible. Because the Shia community up to 9/11 was not only a minority within a minority, it was largely invisible. The Shias barely had any voices. But we find since the events of 9/11 that Shias are very much more proactive, they become more politically motivated, they engage in various responsibilities, for example, serving the non-Muslim community in America, whether it is through food drives, donating blood to them, and basically spreading the message of Imam Hussein through various forms. So it's certainly Shia Islam now has become more, shall we say, visible. And let's not forget also events in the Middle East, whatever it may have been, and there are various different kinds of events, have made the American community also more aware of this distinction between the Shias and the Sunnis. So when I give talks, for example, in churches, synagogues, etc., I'm often asked, tell us about the difference between the Shias and the Sunnis. Even sometimes when you enter America, the immigration officer have asked me, are you Shiite or Sunnite, as they call it, Shias or Sunnis? So it's become more aware, now, the Americans have become more aware of the distinction between the Shias and the Sunnis.
Great. Just before I go to the first question, let me just tell everyone that we are delighted to have people here from all over the world listening in today, from Pakistan, from the UK, from different parts of North America. So again, welcome everyone. Moving straight into the questions. The first one is from Brother Muhammad Kaku. There's a slightly long preamble, so bear with me as we get to the question itself. He says, Shi'ism in America provides the general overview of the Shia community in America, tracing its history and its current composition. However, Shia have not negotiated their identity in the American context as to political activism, are labeled as terrorists, are aligned as nationalist, tribalism, racist within Shias, brackets, blacks, and not involved in dawah, tabligh in correctional facilities. Why?
Okay, why have we done all of that? It would take me too long to go into all the details, but very, very briefly, as I said, that it was only after 9/11 that Shias became more aware of the need to voice themselves. In other words, to make the Shia community more visible. The question of dawah interests me because I do treat it in my book, in the 5th chapter, I believe, is that because the Shias were being attacked, especially by the Wahhabis and Salafis, so much, they felt as a minority they had to protect rather than spread their boundaries more. So they were more engaged in protecting the boundaries, making sure that especially the younger generation does not go towards the American, does not assimilate completely with the American, or be influenced by the Wahhabi criticism. So that was one reason, but I do agree that we do need to engage in different forms, whether it's political activism, da'wah, and I find that that's happening more and more, especially when you go to campuses now, because of the Wahhabi influence on campuses, for example. A lot of campuses on universities have their own Ahlul Bayt group or Shia groups.
All right, thank you for that. Second question comes from Sister Rifat. Were you able to find any evidence of Shia writing amongst the people stolen to America during the Atlantic slave trade? Scholars have written of all the Muslims who were stolen, including rebellions against the slave traders led by black Muslims. But there is no distinction of school of thought. However, at that time, 1600 to 1800, the distinctions may not have been discussed.
Very interesting question. And again, I do treat it in my book. The answer is no, because as far as I know, at least Shia Islam had not spread to West Africa, where most of those slaves came from, in large numbers, or in any numbers for that matter. So, for example, we do know that at least 10 to 15% of those slaves were brought over from Africa, and there were about 10 million at least of them. About 10 to 15% were Muslims. So we know that because of the names on the slave register, we read names like Umar bin Sa'id, for example, Ibrahim al-Bilali, and so many Yarut, Omar, and so on. So we know very clearly these were Muslims. but we do not know of any Shias amongst that particular group.
Right. Next question from Brother Nazmul. Are there any initiatives currently in North America to bridge the gaps between Shia, Sunni for mutual benefit?
There are some groups, I think, who realize that, we need to get away from this fundamentalist version of Islam that, ironically, and perhaps very sadly, Muslims are talking more to non-Muslims than within fellow Muslims. In other words, we have more interfaith dialogue than intra-faith dialogue. And God knows there are so many misunderstandings within the Muslim community itself. There are certain groups I've attended myself, for example, especially in Los Angeles, where Shias and Sunnis have come together to discuss and some of the issues they face, the challenges. There are also, even here in Toronto, for example, the Imams Council, I'm part of that member, and there are Shias and Sunni Imams who come together and discuss issues of mutual interest. But I think that this is a field that has to be explored, that the Shia and Sunni community have to come together and speak with each other rather than against each other.
Yes, there are enough there who'd like to divide us further. And it's only by standing together that we can confront that. Okay, moving on to a question from our mutual friend, Raza Bhai Hijri. How do we design our rituals to unite multicultural Shias to come together?
I don't even know whether we need to do that because, a lot of people would not feel comfortable engaging in rituals which they're not used to or which are kind of belong to a different community. But certainly I find that where there are multi-ethnic centers, and there are quite a few in smaller cities, I've found and I've visited both in America and even abroad. For example, you go to Singapore, you go to New Zealand, whereby you have, Iraqis, Iranians, Pakistanis, Khojas all together. Then you just kind of observe the main ritual that everybody is comfortable with. What is the matam, without going into the zanjir ki matam, or without going into the latmiya or the tatbir that Arab communities, some Arab communities do, not all. So you can try kind of observe the general trend that everybody feels comfortable with. The Khojas will engage in Saf Matam, for example. Now, they're the only ones who do that. I've not seen any Pakistani or Iranians join in Saf Matams. So some of those things will have to be sacrificed in order to, especially in the multi-ethnic centers.
Okay. And from SA, that's all I have, SA, given the challenges Muslims face in the West, shouldn't we be focusing less on Shia-Sunni divide and presenting a united Muslim front?
The answer to that, I think, is yes and no. First of all, we cannot compromise on our principles and our identity. Those as Shias, we have to not only project who we are, but also be proud of who we are. So yes, by all means, project yourself as Shia Muslims, but at the same time, do not divide yourself or speak against fellow Muslims, because that will create even more schism and more sectarian differences within the Muslim community. So yes, by all means, we can be united with them. But as I always say, unity does not mean uniformity. We can be united and yet be different. So, we have to observe and be aware of our basic principles. We have to teach our children as to who are our imams and our identity, but yet not be divided or at least speaking against fellow Muslims.
Next one is from Sister Sabika Shaban. Curious to know if Khoja Sunnis are even smaller minority, and do they share a similar trajectory as Khoja Shias? Also, do Khoja Shias tend to have interfaith initiatives with Khoja Sunnis?
There are a few Khoja Sunnis. I'm not aware of too many of them, but they being Sunnis, they kind of affiliate with Khoja Shias based on the culture, based on the language, rather than based on religion. So you may not find too many of them coming to our centers because of the differences. But yes, culturally they are similar, linguistically they are similar. And of course, when we meet people from our own cultural background, many of us love to speak in our own language because that's Gujarati or Urdu, whatever it may be. So there are some, but I don't think that, we have really fully explored that. And we don't have a separate Khoja Sunni center, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum
Imam
salam.
Takim, I want to clarify a statement that one of the participants made. Imam Takim spent a lot of time coming into the New York State prison system and advocating Shiite Islam. One of the things that I spoke with him about is the disconnect that the African American community don't have a place or is not accepted within the Shiite community at large. And sometimes when me and Imam Takim talk, I speak about how hurtful it is, because if it is all inclusive, then on a political stage, it would be a lot more productive. But we're like on the outside. There are lots and lots of African Americans that practice Shiite Islam, but they don't attend no masjid. Even in the penitentiary, we fought hard to establish the right to pray. Like the stuff that we had to endure just to be able to pray, to come together, to gather, just to be able to get books was like a humongous process. And Imam Takim journeyed that whole journey. I spent 30 years in prison, and he did the majority of that time educating me. He is one of the few people that we reached out to that consistently stood by us. And we wrote all over the world to get help. Even now, I'm home and it's not easy, but we ask for help. But sometimes the help don't come.
Pastor Takim, do you have any reaction to that? Thank you, by the way, Brother Shahid.
Yeah, I know Shahid for over 25 years, I think 25 years, and it's trying to kind of help him out when he was incarcerated. But, what I can say is ditto, to what I've said, that we don't give enough importance to the African American, or as I call them in my book, blessed Shias, because they are largely marginalized, not only in the American community, but even within the Muslim community and also the Shia community. It's something that we really do need to look out for much more.
Thank you again. From Brother Ghulam Mahdi, how is Shi'ism studied in US academia? Do studies of Sufism help or misrepresent Shia studies in current format?
I think that I've always advocated that that is the Shias themselves, we ourselves should be speaking about Shia Islam, because we can't let others speak about it. Jews don't let us speak about Judaism. We don't speak about Christianity. Why should others speak about us? If you don't talk about yourself, others will talk about you, and what they'll say about you will not be very nice. So I've always tried to train Shia scholars and encourage Shia scholars. I think one of the things, and I even talked to Ayatollah Sistani about this, that we need to establish Shia chairs in universities. It only costs about $1.5 to $2 million to establish a chair in a university, and that is forever. I have a chair here at McMaster, which was actually established by the Amir of Sharjah, ironically. But once you establish a chair, then it continues forever. So even if a person retires or dies, then somebody else comes and occupies the chair. The important point being here that we should be talking and teaching about Shia Islam. Others do talk about Shia Islam, sometimes favorably, sometimes not so favorably. Just to give you one example, and this will kind of show us, will tell you, even in the academia, the kind of misrepresentation of Shia Islam. Somebody wrote, he was talking about Muharram rituals, and luckily I was reviewing that book. He wrote that during the first 10 days of Muharram, Shias will not have a shower. They will not shower for 10 days. This is a kind of misrepresentation of Shia Islam. But as I said, that's why it becomes so important that we train Shia scholars academically, who can reach out. Because don't forget, when I teach, for example, Intro to Islam, I'm reaching out to 80, maybe 100 students. And they go out and talk about Shia Islam to others, or about Islam in general to others. That's why it's so very important for us not only to be engaged in other political activity, in civic responsibility, but also in the academia and to reach out to others.
It is remarkable, as you say, how misinformation gets out there. For example, that statement about us not having shower for 10 days. I can't imagine that. But I guess it also talks to the comment from Sister Mariam. It's not a question, it's more of a comment, where she states Western academia gets its info from Sunni sources. I'm reading this verbatim, or anti-Shia sources. So they continuously promoting wrong info about the history and reality of Shias. If you have any comments on that, otherwise I'll move to the next question.
Oh, very quickly. I mean, to a large degree, this was correct until about the year 2000. But since then, we have found more and more publications written about Shi'ism in the academia and about Shia Islam, correcting some of those misperception and misconception. I wrote a paper which was published in the journal Shia International Studies from ICAS in England, in which I showed very clearly how the publications and writings about Shi'ism in the academia has changed dramatically in the past 15, 20 years or so. And I think there's more information and better and more reliable information now, but there's much more that can be done.
Right. I see a couple of people have raised their hand. I'll get to them in a second. Brother Mazar, I've noted your hand raised. Just get to this next question. I feel, this is from Sajjad, Brother Sajjad, I feel the Shia Islam presented by us in the West is a more logical view of Shia Islam compared to the communities in the Middle East. How can we contribute this view back to our own communities? Would it be beneficial?
The reason why we've had to adapt to our the way that we present and talk about Shia Islam, because we have moved. There's been a paradigm shift from conversion to conversation. Before we were trying to convert, especially the Sunnis, to come towards Shia. Now we've realized that instead of converting, we have to be conversating with others. In other words, now we have to talk about ourselves. And to do that, we have to adopt a different approach which is more logical, which especially the non-Muslim community will find more palatable and acceptable, something which is, very broad and not so parochial and narrow-minded. So therefore, we find that we are able to reach out to others more effectively. And I think that also that we should be talking to those Shias, whether in the Middle East or back home, of the need to change the approach, because the younger generation, many of whom are educated in the West or influenced by the West, or because of globalization, they get a lot of information from the West, they may not find the traditional form of preaching to be palatable or acceptable. And in order to protect and preserve the younger generation, we have to make that paradigm shift.
Okay. We've got about less than 10 minutes to go before the call finishes, and questions are still pouring in. So I'm going to ask, in order to let everyone have a chance, I'm going to ask Brother Mazar Dirani to come in and ask his question directly. Brother Mazar, I believe you want to ask Dr. Takim directly. Go ahead, please.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Takim.
Wa alaikum salam.
I wanted to reiterate your stand that the Shia Islam and how did it happen after the Prophet had passed away. There are more outsiders who are giving us an elaborate version. For instance, I was reading a book, very nicely written. It says that after the Prophet, the epic story of the Shia-Sunni split in Islam. And this was written by Hazelton Leslie. I'm sure you know about it. And she has literally gone through a lot of things, which I also didn't know. But I agree to you that if more and more Shia scholars come and elaborate what has happened and why did this split happen. So it was just a comment on what you were just telling us.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think even non-Muslims are realizing now that we have to talk about this split. We have to talk about the Shia community from Shia books, from Shia lens. We cannot talk about Shi'ism from Sunni lens or from Sunni works. Because there's one question here that I really would like to address, if I may.
Go ahead.
This is about how does a PhD in Islamic study differ from the studies in Hausa? I think that's a very important question that we need to talk about, because there's a lot of misunderstanding within the Shia community about that. I think a good scholar, in my view, needs to study both in the West and in the Hausa, because there are courses which are taught in the West which are not taught in the Hausa, and there are courses taught in the Hausa which are not taught in the West. Therefore, I always say that a good scholar should have a mixture of both. The methodology, the way that we approach texts and books are different. The way that we write are also very different. And we have to understand that in the West, writing at the academic level demands certain trajectory of writing, certain methodology. It cannot be subjective, it cannot be apologetic, it cannot be defensive. Whereas the Hausa has a different way. And I'm not saying that it's bad, I'm just saying it's different. So in order to be a scholar, I myself had to spend some time in Iran, in Qom,
Yes.
and then of course in the academia. So I think that also we have to correct this misunderstanding that somehow in the West we are selling out a Shia Islam, that we are trying to please them. No, we don't have to please anybody. We have to please Allah only. So our methodology, our way of presenting things may be different because of the demands that we have to meet, but the ultimate goal is the same.
Thank you. From Ali Zaidi, mostly Americans are not aware of the word Shia. What can be the most influential step to create awareness of the word Shia in the USA?
I think that is not necessarily the case now. I think more and more people are becoming more aware of Shia Islam. We need to reach out at different levels, whether it is in the realm of politics, whether in the media, or in the realm of TV, for example. Now we have social media. We have to talk about ourselves, but in a way which is not deprecatory or which does not look down upon others. At the same time, to explain to others who are the Shia community. The fact that we have these processions, for example, the fact that we have the newspapers, we have internet, etc. All of this. But when you Google Shia Islam, for example, you find all kinds of very negative images about the Shias coming out. And therefore, it's time that we spoke about ourselves.
Brother Tamir Hussain.
I can see his question.
Hello, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Please forgive me. My net is a little broken here.
Well, okay, so I see it too. Did you want to answer that question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, from the Shias are more accepted than Sunnis. To some degree, it is true because, and again, I'm not trying to put down the Sunnis. It's because of the more rational, more akal-minded, if you like, approach to Shia Islam. We do not believe in predetermination, for example. We do believe that one of the main sources of law is reasoning. At the same time, we do, because we are in a minority situation, we are one of those people who have been oppressed for a long time. I think people are more willing to listen to us. But generally speaking, because of the presence of ijtihad, now people are getting a more favorable understanding of Shia Islam that is more rational in its approach. And one thing also that I have to point out, and again, this is not looking down upon any community, but especially after 9/11, the American community has become more aware of who the real terrorists are. Before that, it was always the Shias. Because of Iran, they are the terrorists. But now they realize that the real terrorists are those in Saudi Arabia, those who are following the Salafis and the Wahhabis, and that the Shias are not what they were saying, who we are, and especially because of their experience in Iraq, etc. So I think that overall, and especially as the Shias have become more vocal since 9/11, the Shia community is more accepted by the general American public.
All right, this is from Said and Rehana Kamal to everyone, or Kamal. Can you talk about how you deal with civic economic duties as Americans with the feel-good actions of handing out food, etc.?
Yeah, I know Brother Kamal and Rehana, I think from the community in Denver. And what happened in Denver, interestingly, was that soon after 9/11, the Muslim community got together. the Shia community was a bit small then, and then we joined hands in having an Ansar pantry, whereby basically we had a pantry, and any person who wanted to, especially if they felt that they were homeless or they needed to, they would just go to the pantry and help themselves to food. We would go out to the streets together as a community. What was so, I think, really nice about this approach was that the Shias and Sunnis were together. We were doing it together. The Shia community was too divided and too small, frankly, to do anything substantial. But these are some of the things that we can do to perform our civic responsibilities. Interestingly, also the mayor in Denver initiated a program. It's called to try and reduce homelessness. Every year, at least 100 families were removed from the streets of Denver and given accommodation. And the Shia and the Sunni community were involved in that too. The mayor invited me specifically to be part of that, what we call the clergy council. So I would say that through different ways we can try and reach out and contribute in the name of Ahlul Bayt to the American community.
Yeah. That reminds you of something you once talked about in one of your lectures, I believe, Professor Takim, the concept of, and excuse my pronunciation here, but fastabil khairat, the compete to do good, and that's clearly what they've been doing.
But that's sure, actually, listen to my lectures.
Well, not many others do, but I do. All right, so I'll start to wrap up now. I do want to just acknowledge that it was Dr. Asad Rizvi who asked about the PhD in Islamic Studies. He just provided his name, so thank you for that, Doctor. And so now we'll close the session with sincere thanks to you, Dr. Takim, for joining us today. It was a really very interesting conversation. I think everybody got a lot out of it based on the comments I'm seeing on our text board. So thanks for joining us. The second lot of people I'd like to thank are our subscribers and, of course, our supporters. Without you, we wouldn't be able to do all this. So thank you very much. And to those of you who tuned in today, thank you for your attention and thank you for comments and input. Please feel free to provide feedback. We'd be very open and prepared to take both, any constructive feedback that you have and any suggestions for the future. Lastly, I'd like to just preview our next session, which will be held on September 26th. That's Saturday, September 26th at 12 noon, Conversations with Authors. And this time we will have an author by the name of Liyakat Takim. He's just published his debut book, which is called Keepers of the Faith. It looks like that. And I have started reading it. I'm finding it thoroughly engaging and enjoyable to read. It's about, I won't tell you too much so as not to spoil the surprise, but it's a romance of a sort between a young man and woman called Akbar and Rukhsana, but it's set against the backdrop of 1960s India and specifically a Shia community in the city of Udaipur, where a schism occurs, a split in the community occurs, and the two young lovers are caught on either side of the divide. And it's a remarkable book, and we look forward to welcoming the author Liyakat Takim to our session at that time. So please do tune in and make a note, September 26th, 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. And with that, I'll leave you and close our session for today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time. Khuda Hafiz.